today. This webinar is presented by Heritage Ohio. Our mission is helping people to save the places that matter, build community, live better. Our webinars are supported by the generous contributions of our members and sponsors. This afternoon, we have the Secretary of Interior's standards for rehabilitation, using this for your historic project. Our presenter today is Mariangela Pfister. Mariangela is the department head and deputy state historic preservation officer for the Technical Preservation Services Division. She heads the Technical Preservation Services Department, which manages the Building Doctor program, answers questions about care of older buildings, and works with applicants for the Federal Rehabilitation Investment Tax Credit and the Ohio Historic Preservation Tax Credit. Pfister holds a master's degree in history from The Ohio State University and bachelor's degrees in history, English, and secondary education from Capital University. We will take questions at the end of the presentation, so you can type those into the presentation box just at any time and we'll get to them. And right now, Mariangela, you can take it away.
Thank you so much, Joyce, and my appreciation to Heritage Ohio for giving me this opportunity to talk about the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. The standards have been around as long as I have been in this business and way before that. So for 35 plus years that I've been doing this, these standards have remained exactly the same, which means they are very tried and true. They are very general, but they are also all-encompassing. And we're going to be talking about them this afternoon by breaking down each of the standards. And I'll be explaining to you the purpose as well as showing you some examples. So Joyce warned me that these slides may take a minute to advance. So I have clicked on it.
Click again, it'll work.
I will let it go. I will listen to Joyce and let it go.
Try both return and the arrow. There.
Standards are really guiding principles, and this is a really important point that I want to make. And of all of the things that we do, this probably causes the most confusion. So I'm going to spend a couple minutes on this slide. The standards are applied to all guidance that state historic preservation offices give across the entire country. It applies to the rehabilitation of historic buildings, but not just for the federal historic tax credits, also for grants, also for compliance for 106. But this is really important to understand. Unless there is a governmental hook, like you want to apply for a federal grant, or you have a state historic tax credit or a federal tax credit, the standards are only guiding principles and are not required for the rehabilitation of historic buildings, even ones listed on the National Register of Historic Places. This is important because sometimes people say, I don't want to get my building listed on the National Register of Historic Places because the government is going to step in and tell me what to do with my building. Nothing could be further from the truth. As a private property owner for your National Register listed building, we don't have any say or any input in your building unless you bring us into the conversation. Unless, for example, you want to apply for a federal historic tax credit, then yes, there is this set of standards that we follow. And it really puts everybody on the same level playing field. No matter whether you have a very large project and you've done tax credits and grants multiple times, or whether you are a new applicant, you are all following the same set of standards. If you're doing a project in Kansas, if you're doing a project in Pennsylvania, if you're doing a project in Ohio, you're going to be following the same set of standards. So I really like that because it puts everybody on the same level playing field, and it's the same rules that apply to everyone. And I love it when there's fairness in a program. There are a lot of potential benefits of meeting the standards. So first of all, you are eligible for the federal and state historic tax credits. And at the end of my standards presentation, I'm going to be taking just a few minutes to talk about the federal and state historic tax credits because they are really an excellent way to help finance your historic rehab if you have an income producing property, especially for the federal credits. It also makes you, meeting the standards can also make you eligible for federal grants, such as certified local government grants. Also, I mentioned Section 106. If you have a federal undertaking, then meeting the standards gives you the potential for compliance to meeting the rules for Section 106. Beyond those things, the standards, if you just have your own house and it's historic, and by the way, we consider anything that's 50 years old or older historic. Doesn't have to be listed on the National Register, so the standards can apply to any historic building. But the standards afford you the opportunity to undertake a sensitive rehabilitation of your historic property. There are also additional benefits from the Ohio History Connection and the State Historic Preservation Office in meeting the standards. For example, the history grant, the history fund grants, you have to meet the standards for that program as well. When we talk about the standards, the first thing we really need to talk about is integrity of the building, of the site, and how the standards can help preserve that historic integrity. So we ask ourselves, does this property still maintain what made it significant? We evaluate the essential physical features. The standards ask us to take a good look at the building and think about the building before we do anything to the building. So evaluate those physical features of the building. It's important to remember material integrity cannot be faked or recreated. We're going to be talking about that when we get into a couple of the standards. So once historic material integrity is gone, it's gone. And the standards really work to help you protect it. So meeting the standards in rehabilitation projects help preserve this material historic integrity that cannot be faked and cannot be recreated. The standards look at material and visual impact only, not who you are or who you know or how important your building is or whatever. It goes back to the same level playing field that I was talking to you about. It asks the question, are you impacting the historic material? And what will be the visual impact? Those are the two things that the standards look at. Also, super important to understand, the standards do not compel an applicant to take an action. The standards do not compel that an action be taken. Only that if an action is taken, it is in conformance with the standards. Let me take 2 seconds to explain that. So if you have a historic rehabilitation project and you want to try to get federal tax credits for your National Register listed building, and a previous owner did work that was perhaps a little less than sensitive, work that you would not have undertaken, but you're stuck with this. And you now purchase the building and you're like, oh my gosh, here is this work that, yes, my building still retains integrity. Yes, my building is still listed on the National Register, all those good things, but I really can't afford to change this work, this insensitive work that the previous owner did. The standards do not compel you to do that. If you've inherited something and the building still retains integrity, the standards say that work can stand. That work does not have to change. However, if you opt to touch that work, to make a change to that work, then yes, you have to bring that work into conformance to the standards. You can't just make it better. You can't just say, well, it's better, isn't that good enough? Well, meeting the standards is always going to make things better, but it isn't enough just to make something incrementally better. If you decide to touch the work, you must bring the work into conformance with the standards. So that's a really important point about the standards. They don't force you to do anything unless you decide you want to do something. And then there are these 10 sets of standards that we're going to be talking about. So this is just a fun slide to show you. This is a super lucky building. This is material integrity that's unmasked. Not every building is so lucky, but the folks that, first of all, I'm going to apologize. I don't understand anyone who would cover this building, but for some reason it had been covered. And fortunately for this building, they were able to peel this off and the material integrity was still there, fortunately, and this building contributed. So happy ending. The standards work for every type of building. And when we think about the standards and we consider historic character encompasses a lot of things. It encompasses the environment of the property, the shape of the building, the site on which the property is located, the structure, the spaces in the building, its size, its scale, the materials that make up the building, its details, its level of craftsmanship that went into it. The image that you see is from a historic rehab project here in Ohio, and I wanted to demonstrate to you this is a historic site. This is the environment in which this building was located, and it's important, and it should, and the standards cover it, should be maintained. So the standards for rehabilitation are 10 common sense principles. They are aimed primarily at preserving historic character. They're aimed at repair versus replacement. We're going to be talking about that with Standard 6. And they focus on compatibility. It's not that you can't make any changes. These are not the standards for restoration, and there are standards for restoration, excellent standards for restoration. But what we're talking about are the standards for rehabilitation. How can you rehabilitate your building so that you can use it for modern use and still retain those things that lend it its historic character? Absolutely doable with the application with the standards for rehabilitation. Again, they apply to all types of buildings. I threw in this fun photo of the historic lighthouse in Marblehead. And they pertain to both interiors and exteriors. This is a question that I often am asked. Well, you look at outside only. No, we look at inside and outside, and the standards apply to both. So getting right into the standards, I'm going to give you the formal definition for each of the standards, and then we're going to break down into each standard, and I'm going to give you some examples. So standard 1, a property shall be used for its historic purpose or be placed in a new use that requires minimal change to the defining characteristics of the building and its site and environment. So again, we want to preserve that historic character, but we want to rehab the building. What you see here in the upper right corner is a schoolroom. Now, this is obviously a schoolroom that hasn't been used for quite some time, but the applicant wanted to put a new use, and we're like, go for it. These, it's great to restore, but not everybody can do that. You want to rehab, you want to get the tax credits for that. That is awesome. And so what you see on the left-hand side of the image is that same classroom space rehabilitated. What's compatible about this? It's a new space, right? It's a new use. It's not the same use, but it's a compatible use. This person had an open office plan. They were able to retain the volume of space. They were able to retain the historic windows. They were able to retain the historic metal ceiling. They had to add HVAC. I mean, you have to have modern heating and cooling, right? Well, they were able to do it sensitively, and they were able, my goodness, to even keep the blackboards. So this was a very compatible new use for this historic school, brought it back to life. This is also an example of compatible use. You see on the upper right, a mixed commercial residential building that was very sensitively rehabbed, met standard 1, that is now, oh my gosh, a mixed commercial and residential use. There can't be much more compatible use than the exact same use that it had historically. So it can be both. You can have a compatible brand new use, or you can have a use that is super compatible because it's the same use that the building had historically. Standard 2 tells us that the historic character of a property shall be retained and preserved, and the removal of historic materials or alterations of features and spaces that characterize a property shall be avoided. So we ask in Standard 2 that you preserve historic character. This is a building before and after rehab in over the Rhine, and this is you can see the character defining features of this space of this building in Cincinnati was the retention of the historic windows, the storefront, the piers, the columns for the storefront were all maintained. The top story, the dormers, all maintained, the chimneys maintained. This building retains its historic character and clearly meets Standard 2. This is an interior space. This is a project of mine, a tax credit project, where they had on the image to the left, you see they had borrowed light windows. They had doors with glass and transoms. All of that was retained in the rehab, as you can see. And I'm showing you an interior view of that same space. And it is not the easiest thing in the world to retain all of that glass in an open kind of atrium space. But this project was successfully able to use it. They used Chapter 34 and they were able to meet code and meet the standards at the same time because they preserved the historic character, thus firmly meeting Standard 2. Standard 3 tells us each property shall be recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. Changes that create a false sense of historical development, such as adding conjectural features or architectural elements from other buildings, shall not be undertaken. So basically, don't create false history. The image on the left is the Sycamore Cafe here in Columbus. And except for the little bulkheads underneath the storefront windows, which would probably have been wood historically, and they're now brick, other than that, the Sycamore Cafe has survived the test of time quite well. I can't say the same, though, for the building on the right, which was not a tax credit project. And the building on the right looked like the Sycamore Cafe before it's got what we call its phony colonial do-over. First of all, there were not colonial buildings here in Ohio like that, like anything. And secondly, I don't know how you get into this building. And I'm certain that the owners of this building were well-intentioned. They wanted to, give the building what they considered to be its more historic appearance with the addition of the multi-light storefront windows and the shutters and all of those things. But this is creating a history for the building that it never had. So this would not be in compliance with Standard 3. This, however, is in compliance with Standard 3. There's no false history here. These buildings were successfully rehabbed. So they retain what made them historic, and they did not add. My goodness, you don't need to add anything to these wonderful buildings. There was no conjecture that was needed for these buildings, and there was none added. So this grouping of buildings clearly meets Standard 3. Standard 4 is the standard that I probably get the most questions about, and you're going to see why in a second. So most properties change over time. Those changes that have acquired historic significance in their own right shall be retained and preserved. It is worth repeating that last piece. Those changes that have acquired historic significance in their own right shall be retained and preserved. Let me talk about this for a second. So this is a little Italianate building, and I've been talking for several minutes now about compatibility and the need for compatibility, and it's so important to be compatible. You would not win an argument if you tried to say that this deco moderne storefront was compatible with this little Italianate building. It isn't. It isn't compatible. However, this modern deco storefront is so significant in its own right. It's of such a high level of craftsmanship that Standard 4 says it must be retained. It must be preserved. So we're going to go back for a second. Those changes that have acquired historic significance in their own right shall be retained and preserved. This storefront has retained historic significance in its own right. Even though it is not the most compatible to this historic building, it is so historically significant, Standard 4 would say it needs to be retained. Standard 5 tells us distinctive features, finishes, and construction techniques or examples of craftsmanship that characterize a property shall be preserved. This is a fairly easy one to understand. This is the Holzer Hospital. What you see, this was a historic tax credit project. What you see on the right-hand side is a very, very distinctive entry area, beautiful fluted columns, lovely capitals, the little balconette at the window, all super, super distinctive and all retained in the rehab. And let me tell you, in my house, my husband is the brains and I am the brawn, and so we have a salt box colonial, and I'm the one that's doing all of the scraping and the sanding and doing the epoxy repair and all of that. So I honestly understand at a very base level what it takes to do this kind of rehabilitation, and it's not easy, but it is so worth it, because it's very challenging to replicate completely and without a lot of cost these kinds of features that are of such high level of craftsmanship. So this was successfully retained, and as I said, this was a successful federal tax credit project. This is the Washington School in Washington Courthouse. This is another one of my projects successfully completed. This is a really wonderful high school. I mean, can you imagine as a high school student coming in here every day and seeing the beautiful entry doors and the marble and the crown mold? I mean, beautiful. All of this was retained in the rehabilitation of this school for senior housing. Very successful. And of course, this is the Omni Netherlands Hotel in Cincinnati. This image kind of speaks for itself, just dripping with historic character and significance, all retained in the rehab. Standard 6 is what I call the mother of all of the standards. I alluded to it at the beginning of this presentation, and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about it. So let me read to you the official definition. Standard 6 tells us that deteriorated historic features shall be repaired rather than replaced. Where the severity of deterioration requires replacement of a distinctive feature, the new feature shall match the old in design, color, texture, and other visual qualities, and where possible, materials. Replacement of missing features shall be substantiated by documentary, physical, or pictorial evidence. So, why do I call Standard 6 the mother of all the standards? This is our repair, don't replace standard. Because if you replace everything in your historic building, even if you replace it to match, even if you do the best job at replacing everything to match, what you are left with is a historic looking building and no longer a historic building. Remember, we talked at the beginning that historic integrity cannot be returned. Once it's gone, even if you replace it to match. So do the best you can at retaining those historic features and repairing them. And again, I understand the effort that is involved in repair. Sometimes the severity of the deterioration is so great that it simply can't be repaired. The feature can't be brought back reasonably. And the standards are really reasonable. So if you've got a historic feature that is damaged beyond reasonable repair, Standard 6 has you covered. It's saying document that it really is damaged beyond reasonable repair, document so that you can do a good job at replacing it, and replace it to match. Depending on the significance of the feature that you need to replace, it sometimes needs to be an exact match, depending on where it is in the building and the significance. There are other areas, for example, if you have a secondary space that is maybe a back of house space and you have some deteriorated trim around a doorway and it's really deteriorated beyond reasonable repair. Well, we're going to ask you to be compatible with that trim if you can't undertake a replacement that is an exact match. But when we were looking at the Holzer Hospital before in that entryway, that is a very significant entryway. And if that is deteriorated beyond reasonable repair, then that is going to need to be a really good and exact match. So let's show you some examples that meet Standard 6. So again, Standard 6 is repair rather than replace. The image to the left, this owner, this is a private property owner, private home. This owner is only replacing the wood boards that they need to replace. And you can clearly see which boards are new. So they've really taken Standard 6 to heart. They are keeping all of the historic fabric that is repairable, and they are replacing to match fabric that is really beyond reasonable repair. So this is a complete meeting of Standard 6. The image to the right, this project, they needed to do some repairs to these doors. And these were hard doors to keep. This was housing, and they kept the glass in the doors, and they kept the glass transoms, and these did need repair, but they were able to do just a full-on repair and didn't really have to do any replacement. But sometimes you do have to replace some elements. We're at Fort Hayes, and even though those windows on the upper right look, golly, those just look, and the poor little cornice, boy, that just really looks like it's in rough shape. And it is. And some of those elements can't be reasonably repaired. So they had to be replaced. They used Dutchman, or they did, I'm going to show you an image in a second, where they did a complete replacement of a part of the sash. But they did keep those pieces of the window that were repairable. And so this is a really good example in the lower left. And it's those same windows, lower left, where the windows were able to be repaired with some elements of the windows themselves, pieces having to be replaced, but what they could keep, they kept and repaired. And so very, very clearly meeting Standard 6. And in this example, they simply could not keep the lower sash, the bottom sash. The bottom sash is often the one that takes the most wear and tear, because it's the one that, I mean, when you have a double hung window, the upper sash and the lower sash operate, of course, but usually it's the lower sash that goes up and down the most. They could keep the upper sash, and so they did, but they had to do a replacement on the lower sash. So this is another perfect example of Standard 6. They kept the historic upper sash because they could, because it was repairable, and they replaced the lower sash because they had to, because it was beyond reasonable repair, but it is an exact match to the upper sash. So really good example of Standard 6. Standard 7 is our do no harm standard when it comes to chemical or physical treatments such as sandblasting that cause damage to historic material shall not be used. The surface cleaning of structures, if appropriate, shall be undertaken using the gentlest means possible. So again, our do no harm standard. In the lower left, you see a brick that has some patina on the left-hand image, left-hand portion of this image. This patina does not bother me at all. I think that it looks like old brick, and that's what it is. But sometimes you've got patina that is doing harm to the brick. Well, that needs to be removed if it's causing harm to your brick or to your mortar. So what in the lower left image shows you is we did a split of this image. On the right, they did a very gentle cleaning method, which I'm going to be talking about in a second, so that you can see there is no abrasion of the brick. The mortar looks perfect. This is, if you have to clean brick, if you really feel you really need to clean that brick, or if what's on the brick is doing it some damage, then certainly, yes, definitely clean it. But this clearly meets standard 7 because no damage happened to this masonry in the cleaning process. Unfortunately, the image in the upper right, not so lucky. They removed the hard outer coating. You all may know, I think of brick as like a loaf of French bread. So you've got a hard outer crust, you've got a soft inner belly. And when you do abrasive cleaning to that brick, you are going to remove that hard outer coating and expose the soft inner belly. And that is irreversible. There is nothing that can be done. And then unfortunately, in this image, the reason for doing it is they wanted to remove the paint. You can see what great success they had with that. Not. And then to add insult to injury, they added very wide, inappropriate mortar joints that are of hard Portland. So now these poor bricks that have been compromised are now being compressed by very hard Portland cement mortar. So this would not meet standard 7. But this kind of cleaning of this stone does meet standard 7. This person who's doing this cleaning needs no protection because there's nothing destructive about the cleaning that the method that he's using. This is likely a non-ionic detergent, natural bristle brush, and it really, really has good results. I mean, you can really do significant surface cleaning, and then a low PSI water pressure, under 300 PSI, pointed down, not up, to rinse it off. You don't have to worry about hazardous runoff or anything with this non-ionic detergent and this natural bristle brush method. So this would absolutely meet standard 7. Because there is no abrasion and you've got a cleaner building. So everybody wins, everybody is happy. Standard 8 is our archaeology standard. Significant archaeological resources affected by a project shall be protected and preserved. If such resources must be disturbed, mitigation measures shall be undertaken. I have, as I mentioned, been working in this business. I've been a historian for the State Historic Preservation Office now for over 35 years. And I think it's literally the best job in the world. But I hadn't been able to use standard 8 in all the time. I had been apply it to a project until Cincinnati Music Hall. They were doing some work and they were in an orchestra pit and they were digging and they came across human remains. Well, that job stopped and standard 8 was applied and they were able to sensitively mitigate the human remains and manage that. And it was a really interesting learning process for me. As a historian, I was trained a little bit in archaeology on the job. I mean, when I first started here, we had a division chief who wanted us to understand a little bit about all of the work that our SHPO office does. And so I actually got to go out on a couple of digs, and that was super interesting. But applied to a federal tax credit project, never got to do that before. and I got to do it with Music Hall. It was very interesting, and I learned an awful lot. And so Standard 8 can apply to rehabilitation projects. And they really talk about preserving our below ground, our prehistory, and our historic archaeological history as well. I'm going to show you here in a second. Very important to retain and preserve. This was a beehive cistern in, again, Cincinnati, and it was under a asphalt walkway, asphalt, and then there was underneath that was cement, and underneath that was brick. And then you found this perfectly intact beehive cistern. And the image to the left shows you what was discovered in this beehive cistern. It really spoke volumes about how people lived their lives. Buildings speak volumes on how people live their lives, but things that you find in a beehive cistern is also going to speak volumes to that. So again, this was a win-win. Standard 9 says new additions, exterior alterations, or related new construction shall not destroy historic materials that characterize the property. The new work shall be differentiated from the old and shall be compatible with the massing, size, scale, and architectural features to protect the historic integrity of the property and its environment. And that's what this is all about. It's to protect the historic integrity of the historic property. So let me show you some examples. This is a tax credit project that required the introduction of an elevator. You can see the elevator addition in the lower right. It could not have been more sensitively placed and more sensitively done. It's made of a material that, while not replicative of the brick, which they could have used brick if they'd wanted to, is a masonry product that was painted out. And it really is a sensitive addition, and it clearly meets Standard 9. This is also a very sensitive addition, and again, speaks to compatibility. So this is an observatory. Again, we're in Cincinnati, and they needed to add some handicapped accessibility to this building. And so the image on the lower left shows how they sensitively did that. It does not distract in any way, and it lends folks with some mobility issues a way to get into this building, and it clearly meets Standard 9. And it's all about, again, preserving the historic character while making the building function for a modern use. So a really good rehab. Standard 10, our final standard, tells us that new additions and adjacent or related new construction shall be undertaken in such a manner that if removed in the future, the essential form and integrity of the historic property and its environment would be unimpaired. I'm going to take a second before I show you the example for this one to talk about this standard. Sometimes people use this standard to do things that don't meet the other 9 standards. And they say, well, but what we're doing is reversible. You can remove it. So I mean, I'm okay, right? Because I meet Standard 10 because what I'm doing is reversible. No. In order to be a certified tax credit project, in order to get a grant, in order to meet the standards, you need to meet all 10 standards. If you violate one standard, then you don't meet all of the standards. And for projects through our office, because again, as I mentioned, our office operates under the Secretary of the Interior standards for everything that we do, you have to meet all 10 standards. So while we do ask that additions be reversible in case a historian 50 years from now wants to remove something that you did, they'll be able to do that without significant damage to the historic building. Sure, that's important, but it isn't an excuse to not meet the other 9 standards. You have to meet all of the standards. This is an example of a vestibule, an airlock that was added here in Columbus to our main library. And you could literally pop this vestibule, this airlock out, and there would be no damage to the walls, to the ceilings, to the beautiful, incredibly significant floor, no damage. You could pop it out. So this one absolutely meets standard 10. However, this also meets all the other standards because it's transparent. It doesn't take up too much of the space, and so that your notion of the space is blocked in any way. So in addition to meeting standard 10, it meets the other standards as well. So I promised you a little teaser at the beginning. I promised you to talk about the federal historic tax credits for just a second. I know I only have a couple minutes left, but the tax credits are really an excellent way to get your sensitive rehabilitation that conforms to all of the standards for an income producing property paid for. You can get some help paying for it. It's a 20% federal tax credit. You have to have a certified historic structure, which means it has to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places, either individually or as a contributing resource in a historic district. And while we definitely work on individual properties for the federal historic tax credits, most of our work is for contributing buildings in historic districts. So it is 20% of your qualified rehabilitation expenditures, called QREs. And I'm going to give you a very, very, very basic explanation of the QREs. My first piece of advice is talk to your tax attorney or your tax accountant, and they will do a much better, more in-depth job about talking to you about QREs. But for me as the layman, when talking about money, because the IRS always asks us, we don't do windows, so don't you guys do the money part, don't you do the dollar sign, we'll take care of that. But people often say, okay, well, just in general, what can you think about with a QRE? So if you take your building and you turn it upside down and you shake it, pretty much anything that falls is going to be not a QRE. Anything that sticks, anything that is attached, that's probably going to count as a QRE. It's work to and within the building envelope. That elevator addition that I showed you a little while ago, that would not count towards your QREs. That would not work because that is outside, that is an addition. But if you had to do masonry repointing, that is in your building, on your building envelope, that counts. If you have to do mechanical systems work, that counts. Refinishing your floors, repairing your windows, replacing your roof if your roof needs replacement, all of that counts as long as you meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. So we review them here at the State Historic Preservation Office. We are the review arm for the National Park Service, but all federal tax credit projects are approved by the National Park Service. It is a joint program between the National Park Service and the Internal Revenue Service. And as I mentioned, in order to qualify for the 20% federal rehab tax credit, you must meet the standards for rehabilitation. The same is said for the 25% Ohio Historic Preservation Tax Credit. This is an excellent tax credit. It is 25% of your QRE costs, and it is refundable. It is very competitive, though. In this one, the certified historic structure has to be listed either on the National Register as an individual building or contributing. But if you are not listed on the National Register of Historic Places, you can still qualify for the optic credit if you are designated as a historic building by your certified local government. However, even if you are designated as a historic building by your certified local government, which allows you to put in an application for optic, that doesn't qualify you for the federal credit. The only way you can qualify for the federal credit is to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places, either individually or within a district. As I said, it's 25% of your qualified rehabilitation expenditures. And as I also said, it is competitive. The state allocates $60 million a year. There is a set aside for smaller projects. We just finished round 25, the silver anniversary round. Yay, yay, yay for the optic credit. We just literally wrapped that up last week. It is a joint program between the Ohio Development Services Agency, which makes all final decisions and does all of the financial calculations. The Ohio History Connection through the State Historic Preservation Office. We make the decision, and for the state credit, it is a decision. For the federal credit, the Park Service makes the decision. For the optic credit, we at the state level make the decision as to whether the building is historic and whether the work meets the Secretary of the Interior standards. And then the final partner in optic is the Ohio Department of Taxation. So Joyce, I think I get some kind of credit because I'm usually not on time, but I worked hard to be on time for this one. So that is the end of my formal presentation. I work in the Technical Preservation Services Department of the State Historic Preservation Office. You can get my direct contact information. Right now, because of the global situation, we are not able to be in the office very much. We are really looking forward to a time that we can get back in. But if you have interest in the state tax credits, I have given you Nathan Bevel's email. He is our first point of contact. He is in my department, and all new projects go through him first. He is also excellent at walking people who might be new to the state tax credit process through the process. So please take note of Nathan's email there. He is our first point of contact. So we are the Ohio History Connection. And at this point, I'd be very happy to try to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Mariangela. We have a few questions that have come in. First, again, everybody who's been on the webinar, you will receive a link to the recording of this webinar in an hour or two. It'll come from GoToWebinar. Also, if you want a copy of the actual PowerPoint presentation, I'm going to have Mariangela send it to me. You can email me at jbarrett@heritageohio.org, and I'll send it to you, or I'll send you a link through Dropbox if there's too many pictures. Okay, we ready for questions, Mariangela?
Of course, I'll try my best.
Okay, the first one is, if brick is deteriorating, what are your thoughts on newer, safer paint for bricks?
So before let me talk about paint as sort of the last resort for brick. But first, we're gonna ask you some questions. Can you turn the brick? So one summer I decided to, one thing to know about me is I'm pretty cheap. And so, and plus, because I have a little bit of knowledge, it makes me be very persnickety about work that's done. And so I knew that no one would probably do my chimney repointing job the way that I wanted it done. So I ended up doing it myself. And I found that I had some brick that was pretty deteriorated. But what I did was I flipped it. I flipped the bricks, and I found that that can be a really effective tool, and you're preserving historic fabric. If you don't want to do that, or for some reason you can't do that, the thing about paint is, the reason I call it sort of the last resort is because you're really going to change the character of the building by painting it. Now, sometimes, depending on where a brick was fired, some brick are going to be harder than other bricks, right? And so sometimes brick was historically painted because it needed to be historically painted because the brick was already softer. Also, paint really tells a story of the history of a building. For example, Greek Revival buildings, a lot of them are painted, and a lot of them are painted white. And so that really speaks to the historic integrity, the character of the building. Very important. But if you've never had paint on your building, just know that once you paint it, it's pretty much going to be painted for always, and that's going to become a maintenance thing for you. our neighbor across the street painted their red brick building that was in really beautiful shape because they wanted it to be white. And it's their building. They didn't use any federal money involved. They could do whatever they wanted to their building. But all I could think about was, you have now created a maintenance issue for the person who wants to own this building in 50 years. So that's a long-winded way to say, if you've got brick that for some reason can't be turned, and you want to keep that historic brick and it's just really failing, paint can be a reasonable option. Just know it's going to change the character of that building, and it's a forever kind of thing.
Do you want to follow up with a real quick, what do you do if your building's previously been damaged by sandblasting?
Thank you so much for that question, Joyce. That is tough. That is a very tough thing, because that damage is irreversible. And in that instance, if you have powdering of your brick, well, the first thing you could do is make sure that you've got water away from the building, because your exposed brick, because the hard outer coating has now been removed, your exposed brick is going to wick up moisture, and through freeze thaw, you're going to have spalling of the brick and all of that. The other thing to do, besides protecting your brick from moisture, making sure your drainage system is functioning, make sure that you have a positive grade away from your building. I'm a big proponent of putting an intermediate layer. So what I do is I build up a positive grade. I was just doing it a month or so ago around my own foundation. I create a positive grade. I put a layer of visqueen. Then I put another layer of dirt down, and then I put like river rock down, because even if you have a really torrential rain and your drainage system overflows a little bit, when it hits that visqueen, because of that positive grade, it's going to be directed away from the building. So, and moisture rises by capillary action. So you want to get through masonry. So you want to get that moisture away from your building. So that's the number one most important thing for any brick, whether it's been compromised with blasting or not. And Joyce, I'm really glad you raised this, because one thing I didn't mention is it's not just sand. I mean, you can use air. I mean, air, if you throw it at a building at a high enough PSI, it's going to cause damage, and baking soda and ice pellets and all of these things that I hear about. If you throw it at a building at a high enough pressure, it is going to cause damage, and you don't want to do that. But let's say it's already happened. So keep the moisture away, make sure that your mortar is nice and soft and it isn't causing compression of the brick. And then if you still have additional powdering and you can't get those bricks turned around, because you can't do it on an entire building, you just can't. I mean, you'd be forever. It just would not, it wouldn't work out. You'd be deconstructing the building and reconstructing it. Wouldn't work out. So that's a situation where paint might be a reasonable option. You don't want to use a sealant though, because even though they're breathable, there is air, right, that is going to pass through, and sometimes you've got those water molecules that are trapped in the air. There are some sealants that are okay, but I would want to have a sidebar conversation with you if you want to use sealant, because if you don't, and sealants are also kind of the thing of last resort, because when you have a sealant that's an improper sealant, what'll happen is that, again, as that moisture in the air gets caught between the sealant and the substrate, you got the freeze thaw, it will cause that sealant to eventually fail. Maybe not in the first year, maybe not in the fifth year, but eventually that will fail, and it'll bring with it the substrate to the depth at which it penetrated the substrate. So a more reasonable option, if you've got no other options, would be in that instance to paint. Now, what I would suggest is that if you're doing this to a building that had never been painted before, that you use a paint that would be compatible to the style of the building, and just, you know, again, compatibility is the name of the game with respect to the standards, keeping your historic fabric and compatibility. So I hope that answered it. Did that help?
Yes, that's great. And I think gray was never a historic color on brick. Just in case anybody's watching a home improvement show, don't paint it gray. we We have another question. Why are so many grants dependent upon being a CLG?
Well, that is a very good question for Nathan Bevel, the gentleman who I've referred you to if you're interested in the tax credits. The deal is that we used to, my first job here, actually, with the State Historic Preservation Office, was as a grants coordinator under the old jobs bill grant. Joyce, I have just dated myself. So there used to be 50-50 grants that you could get. Those went away after the jobs bill grants. There were no more like 50-50 grants. And so the certified local government grants are really the grants that the state historic preservation offices have to re-grant. It's not that we wouldn't like to have more. It's not that we would not like to have those 50-50 development grants back, believe me, but we've not been allocated the money to do that. So what we do have, though, is the certified local grant program, and that's how we administer grants. Now, there might be other grants. I mean, in addition to Nathan, who can talk with you about CLG grants, Mary Beth Hirsch in our office is the point person if you want to look at sometimes like there are other grants that are not run through our office that she might be able to direct you to. But the reason for the CLG grants is because that's the grant program that our office was left with. And we used to have others, like I said, the 50-50 development grants, but this is what we've been allocated for now for, goody golly, over 30 years.
I think maybe the question too, to make sure they understand that the CLG program, Certified Local Government Program, is kind of a little bit of a stamp of approval that a community is operating a well-run historic preservation program. And so other grants will refer to, are you a CLG community? Because then they know that you're following federal guidelines with your Historic Preservation Commission and program. So it's kind of a bar.
Wow, very good.
Okay, another question. If you have a second floor being used for multiple offices, spaces, at what point do they need to add an elevator?
Oh, so that's a code issue. And we do not get into code issues. We are not permitted actually to design projects. And I'm a historian, and that is a question for your code official. What I can say is that my understanding is depends on the use, depends on the maximum occupancy, but that is absolutely something that I need to refer you to your local code official. Now, once you have a plan in place, if you're interested in pursuing tax credits, come in and meet with us. First of all, call Nathan and he will have me look at who to have you meet with. You can come in for a pre-application meeting and we will walk through your project with you and we will red flag things and we'll talk with you about your proposal. We just can't design your proposal. So that question I'm going to defer to the code official. And it also is a good opportunity for you to get to know your local code official as well. Sorry, Joyce, you were going to add something, I'm sure, very important to that.
Yeah. Elizabeth Murphy of Chambers, Murphy and Burge did a presentation a few weeks ago for us on ADA accessibility, and it answered some of those questions. There are some exceptions to not every building has to have an elevator, so a two-story building, things like that. So I'd refer you, go back to Heritage Ohio's YouTube page, and there is a recording of the ADA accessibility webinar that it was specifically pointed towards federal grant projects and federal historic tax credits meeting ADA accessibility. And she does refer you to your local building code official in many ways, but gives you some other tidbits there. So do we have any other questions? When you're unfamiliar with the Secretary of Interior's guidelines, it's a lot to consume the first time, but as you become more and more comfortable and familiar with it, you'll catch on. So please do ask questions. As we wait for another question, any Any other words of wisdom, Mariangela, that you'd like to share?
Sure.
Most common question?
Well, our number one, absolutely number one common question that we get all the time is about moisture. So I talked a little bit about keeping moisture away, but what I find very interesting in this just bizarre world that we are finding ourselves in is that they talk a lot about the importance of ventilation, right? And in getting fresh air. Historic buildings are really good at allowing the introduction of fresh air. Boy, those double hung windows, they allow you to actually get fresh air in the building. And right now at my house, we keep a window cracked open no matter what. Now, my family doesn't get to change the dial on the furnace because I also try to be ecologically sound, but historic buildings are supposed to breathe. It's not just good for the historic building, but it's good for the people that occupy the historic building. So in all this conversation with the importance of getting fresh air in, I think instantly of historic buildings and how historic buildings, if they're allowed to, do breathe. The other thing about a historic rehabilitation project is that it is can be very environmentally sound. You are reusing historic material. You are not destroying it and rebuilding and using all new materials, which, by the way, you can't. I mean, old growth wood is kind of irreplaceable. And so rehabilitation projects are good on so many levels. Not only do they preserve history, they preserve our historic built environment, which tells us a story about where we came from. So preserves history, but it preserves the environment, and it's also good for the people that occupy the building. So that's my little soapbox speech, Joyce. I'm sure you've heard it like 50 million times, but there you go.
Okay, we'll give you just a few more moments to ask a question. This is a great opportunity while you have Mariangela's undivided attention.
I want to take a second too to thank Heritage Ohio for sponsoring this. It really is helpful. The more people that understand the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation, the more opportunity they have to meet the standards, which again, even if you don't want to secure any kind of funding, it isn't a requirement if you don't want to secure any kind of federal funding or federal hook or governmental hook, but it just is a sensitive way to treat your wonderful historic building. So thank you, Heritage Ohio.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. Again, you will receive an invitation to the link to the recording from GoToWebinar. Email me at jbarrett@heritageohio.org if you want a copy of the presentation. And we've got webinars already scheduled for January. So we have 5 new questions for historic house museums, and I got that title wrong, and demystifying social influencers. So we'll see you all in January. Happy holidays to all of you. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.